everybody, I'm Luna and welcome back to Luna Ơi. This video is a collaboration with the International magazine. The International magazine is an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-fascist magazine run by a global team of over 35 young communist leaders from more than 25 countries all over the world. This video is based on an article from the International magazine, co-written by Vijay Prashad and Manolo de los Santos, entitled International Solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. And it covers what happened on the day of the counter-revolutionary protest in Cuba on July 11th. And it also explains how the United States sanctions actually work and how the sanctions affect the Cuban people. This is just one of many awesome articles that you can find in the International magazine. A full subscription is just $2.50 per month or $25 per year. So if you find this information interesting, I highly encourage you to check it out and consider subscribing. The link is right in the description. Now, on to the video.
On July 11, 2021, when news reached Havana of protests in San Antonio de los Baños, Cuba's President Miguel Díaz-Canel got into a car and drove 60 kilometers to that town. When he arrived there in the afternoon, Díaz-Canel met the protesters and talked with them about their frustrations. Dissatisfaction is normal in any society, particularly during the uncertainty of the pandemic, which has exacerbated economic problems around the world.
We have had similar problems in Vietnam. During the worst outbreak in Ho Chi Minh City, which is just finally getting contained, a lot of city residents face economic hardships. The city imposed a mandated quarantine, which no doubt saved countless lives, but unfortunately, it also meant that thousands of people lost their jobs and incomes, and countless businesses had to shut down. I have made many videos talking about these issues in detail, and I will link to them in the description, so please check them out if you want to learn more.
Since 1962, Cuba has faced, in addition, a harsh blockade by the United States government, which has outlasted one U.S. president after another, and which now affects a third generation of Cuban society. While the U.S. claims that the blockade does not restrict the purchase of key humanitarian supplies such as medicines, there are any number of restrictions on the sale and transportation of these items. For example, on food, the U.S. permits Cuba to buy food from the U.S., but the permissions extend largely to purchases from U.S. firms. These purchases must be made in hard currency, U.S. dollars, and the payments must be made before the goods can be inspected. Furthermore, private shipping companies are wary of carrying goods into Cuba because of the uncertain way in which U.S. secondary sanctions might apply to them. The U.S. blockade prevents goods from entering Cuba, which results in shortages of key goods and therefore increases the frustrations of everyday life.
Many people believe that the sanctions were placed on Cuba because of human rights violations or some other humanitarian reason. But the brutal truth is that the USA placed the sanctions on Cuba because they felt Cuba's government was too popular and successful, and they want the people to suffer so they will become dissatisfied. This was clearly admitted in the following document from the United States State Department.
Memorandum from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Mallory to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Rubadam. Washington, April 6, 1960. Subject: The decline and fall of Castro. Salient considerations respecting the life of the present government of Cuba are: 1. The majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate I have seen is 50%. 2. There is no effective political opposition. 3. Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. 4. Communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. 5. Militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. 6. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. If the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it would be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. The principal item in our economic quiver would be flexible authority in the sugar legislation. This needs to be sought urgently. All other avenues should likewise be explored, but first, a decision is necessary as to the line of our conduct. Would you wish to have such a proposal prepared for the Secretary?
So, as you can see, it's clear that the true purpose of the sanctions is to hurt the people, a disgustingly inhumane position. Over the last 20 years, many countries in the United Nations have continuously called for the ending of these unjust sanctions against Cuba. This year, 184 countries out of a total 189 countries voted to end the embargoes on Cuba. There are only 2 countries that voted against it, and of course they are the USA and the USA. And Israel. It is a fact that the whole world, otherwise, stands against these sanctions, with only the USA and its puppet pushing the embargoes on Cuba. My question is, if the USA government is so sure that communism always fails, then why do they need to enact these sanctions? Why not just let Cuba fail on its own, if you're so certain that socialism always fails?
President Diaz-Canel spoke openly with the people about the long-term problem of the blockade, as well as the immediate problem of the pandemic, with COVID-19 cases on the rise, and of the 243 coercive measures put in place by former U.S. President Donald Trump and retained by current U.S. President Joe Biden.
I'm sorry to tell you this, USA liberals, but to us, people of color in the global south, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are like 2 sides of the same coin. No matter what party takes power in the US, you're always bullying the whole world. To us, the USA is the biggest terrorist organization on earth.
While President Diaz-Canel was in San Antonio de los Baños, it became clear that both the U.S. government and the right-wing Cuban exiles in the United States had seized upon these protests, defined them as protests against the Cuban Revolution, and encouraged them to escalate into a counter-revolutionary situation. As a result, President Diaz-Canel therefore called upon the Cuban people to take to the streets and stand with the Cuban Revolution. That evening, tens of thousands of people across the country held aloft Cuban flags and banners of the 26 July movement, which led the 1959 revolution. They came to stand with the Cuban revolutionary process.
I was paying close attention as the events unfolded, and I have to say, a lot of misinformation was spread about these events. Right from the moment I saw those counter-revolution protests with their slogans and banners in Cuba, I immediately knew that this was another attempt of starting a color revolution. I know a lot about color revolutions because Vietnam has been dealing with these kinds of interventionist campaigns from capitalist nations, especially the USA, for decades, and we can smell them from miles away. There were countless fake Twitter accounts pushing false information and countless instances of mainstream capitalist media outlets spreading deceptive propaganda about what was happening in Cuba, including showing massive pro-communist rallies and presenting them as anti-communist protests and showing photos of protests that were not even in Cuba, among countless other lies. If you don't know what color revolution means and how these false flag tactics have been used to further the goals of imperialist nations, please check out these 2 videos where I talk about this topic in more detail.
But pressure from the United States did not relent. On 12 July, Biden released a statement saying that he was with the Cuban people. However, there was no loosening of the blockade nor a softening of the tone given the mass demonstrations for the socialist revolution. 10 days later, the U.S. government imposed individual sanctions on Cuba's Minister of Defense, Alvaro Lopez Miera, accusing him of being behind a crackdown against the protests. Evidence for such a crackdown is missing. There had been arrests of people who attacked public property, but they were released within a day. Some of them have been charged, and the legal process continues.
Oh, wow. So the USA is concerned on crackdowns on protesters, eh? Meanwhile, I wonder how many protesters have been beaten, shot, illegally arrested, or even killed by the police in the USA throughout the pandemic. We have thousands of pictures and countless hours of footage proving that the extremely harsh crackdowns have been enacted against protesters in the USA. But I'm really sure that nobody is calling for individual sanctions against any USA police ships, nor the United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Now let's learn a little bit about Cuba's Minister of Defense.
Who is Alvaro Lopez Miera, who became the Minister of Defense in April 2021? In 1957, at the age of 14, Lopez Miera went up to the Sierra Maestra to join the rebels against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. He was inspired by the example of his parents, who had been partisans in the Spanish Civil War and who fled to Santiago de Cuba when the Spanish Republic was defeated by the fascists in 1939. López Miera was allowed to participate in the Second Front led by Raúl Castro, but only in the education department. He spent the next 2 years teaching peasants in the Sierra how to read and write. Subsequently, López Miera worked in the Cuban military, volunteering to be part of the anti-colonial Operation Carlota in Angola in 1975, where he returned in 1987, and to be part of the defense of Ethiopia against Somalia in the Ogaden War from 1977 to 1978. This is the background of the man now sanctioned by the U.S. government without any evidence having been presented to the public of any crimes. On July 23rd, over 400 people published an open letter to President Biden in the New York Times. The letter was headlined, "Let Cuba Live," which became a hashtag for a massive online movement of solidarity. We find it unconscionable, especially during a pandemic, to intentionally block remittances and Cuba's use of global financial institutions, given that access to dollars is necessary for the importation of food and medicine, the letter noted. The letter pointed out that in April 2020, 7 UN special rapporteurs wrote a letter to the U.S. government regarding the sanctions on Cuba. In the pandemic emergency, they wrote, the lack of will of the U.S. government to suspend sanctions may lead to a higher risk of suffering in Cuba.
I, myself, lived through the comprehensive sanctions that the USA imposed on Vietnam. Those sanctions put my entire village in extreme poverty and caused deep personal suffering for me and my entire family. The United States has no right whatsoever to do that to any country on earth. I have 2 videos talking about my childhood under USA sanctions. Please check them out if you want to listen to my own first-hand experience about living under the USA sanctions.
On June 23rd, exactly 1 month before the letter was published, 184 member states of the UN voted, as they have for the past 30 years, to ask the United States government to end the blockade. Across the world, people asked 2 questions. First, why does the U.S. government continue to suffocate the Cuban people? And second, what can we do about it? The answer to the first question, why the U.S. government wants to overthrow the revolution, is simple. The United States government since 1959 has not tolerated the presence of a socialist government on its doorstep. Cuba's revolutionaries overthrew a mafia dictatorship to begin a difficult transition to sovereignty and socialism. They put people before profit, building up collective structures of social welfare in education, medicine, and social security, as well as building up a productive system that would not, in the future, rely upon the sale of raw materials, largely sugarcane. That Cuba had the gall to embark on this experiment was sufficient for the U.S. to begin a sanctions and blockade policy. That policy predated the Cuban alignment with the USSR, and it predated the entry of Soviet warships into Havana Harbor. And the sanctions and blockade policy continued despite the 1991 demise of the USSR. For the United States elites and their right-wing Cuban allies, the problem with Cuba is that the island has decided to reject capitalist values in favor of a socialist experiment. The answer to the second question, what we can do, is much more difficult. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of India, Marxists for instance, raised 10,000 tons of wheat and 10,000 tons of rice through a massive campaign that went from the fields of Punjab to the dales of Kerala. In December 1992, the Caribbean princess departed from West Bengal for Cuba. It was received in Havana by CPI-M leaders Harkishan Singh Surjit and M.A. Babi, as well as the Cuban leadership, including Fidel Castro. Castro said that the bread which would come from the wheat would be called the bread of India. Right after July 11th, such large-scale solidarity came immediately from fraternal countries in Latin America and from Russia as well as China. Before July 11th, the Mexican government had already sent an Air Force supply plane with 800,000 syringes for Cuba. Cuba has developed 5 vaccine candidates for COVID-19, but it does not have the domestic industrial capacity to manufacture syringes. 10 days after the events of July 11th, Mexico's state-run oil company Pemex sent a ship, Jose Maria Morelos II, from Coatzacoalcos, Veracruz, with 100,000 barrels of diesel. This fuel will run the power for Cuba's hospitals. Meanwhile, El Libertador and El Papaloapan carry medical supplies, face masks, oxygen, syringes, and food, beans, cooking oil, flour, powdered milk, tuna, to Cuba. The Augusto C. Sandino left Managua, Nicaragua, loaded with food. Rosario Murillo, Nicaragua's vice president, said that the ship is a weapon against these times of a pandemic that also includes the Yankee plague that we are fighting. She meant the sanctions regime that operates against Nicaragua as well as Venezuela, and about 30 other countries. An air flotilla went from Bolivia to Cuba, carrying over 20 tons of medical and food supplies, while ships carrying 30 food containers and 20 tons of rice came to Havana from Venezuela. Meanwhile, 2 AN-124 cargo planes traveled from Moscow to Havana with 88 tons of aid, including canned food and 1 million masks. Aircraft left China with 30 ventilators and other supplies. Cuba has over the past 60 years upheld its sovereignty throughout the revolutionary process. It has been able to withstand direct assault by the United States, and it has been able to survive the collapse of the USSR. Cuba is, like Venezuela, now in deep danger. Biden might not be able to provoke a military invasion, but he will do everything possible to undermine the government and to create internal problems. That is why international solidarity with Cuba is so imperative. It is time to stand with Cuba. It is time to let Cuba live. In 2002, Ignacio Ramonet asked Fidel Castro if the revolution could collapse. Yes, Fidel said, the country can self-destruct, can destroy itself. This revolution can destroy itself. A country must change, must correct its errors, must defend itself from myopia. That's why we are acting. We are marching towards a total change in our society. Fidel had the correct attitude. It was infectious. It spread across the island, whose destiny rests in its creative response to the current crisis.
I would like to thank Vijay Prashad and Manolo de los Santos for this very insightful article. And I would also like to thank the International Magazine for delivering great articles like this to our comrades all over the world. In this capitalist hellhole where corporate news dominates the media landscape, it is very, very hard to find trustworthy leftist news sources that really serve the working class. If you want to access a leftist news source which is totally biased towards communism, and which is built by the working class and for the working class, I really recommend you to check out the International Magazine. I really recommend you to check out the latest issue, which has articles on the human-centered economic successes of socialist Cuba, the destruction of Africa's environment, BlackRock, Vanguard, and CEO. Why and how Korea was divided. Mutumbaism, how the process of neoliberal globalization has turned Kenya into a second-hand nation. In the future, I will do more collaborations with International Magazine to bring you stories from all over the world from a leftist perspective. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching and see you next time!